All right, welcome back to the podcast, everybody, for what is either episode 72 or 62, because I don't even know which tens bracket I'm in anymore. This is a podcast, so the only thing on the screen is going to be a shifting visual backdrop. Thank you to my newest PayPal donor. And if anybody else wants to support the podcast or just help me continue to be able to exist, then PayPal and Patreon links are both down in the description below and in the top pinned comment. Now, to get started with this, an episode that I had already recorded once before, but then accidentally deleted. So starting with the biggest milestone crosser, U.S. crude oil inventories have finally fallen back under 500 million barrels in storage, being drawn down by about 4.4 million barrels over the course of the previous week. And this is after they've been up in the 500s for quite a number of months because of the initial couple months of global oversupply that came about as a result of the initial effects of the whole 2020 situation, as demand collapsed worldwide, not just in the US but everywhere, but in the US in particular, it collapsed, and obviously the height of it was April, like almost everywhere else. And US oil consumption is normally between 20 and 22 million barrels a day in present day. However, in April of this year, it had fallen all the way to just under 14 million barrels a day, and obviously since then, over the months, it's been recovering and has almost come back up to 20 million barrels a day a few times. But the initial 2 months of primary oversupply, basically April and most of May, caused not just U.S. inventories, but inventories all over the world to swell up, and U.S. inventories in particular went up over 500 million barrels in storage, and even got up towards about 550. However, over the past couple months, they've been drawing back down, as the global supply deficit now continues as a result of both lost production from the oil price collapse and the loss and shutdown of numerous drilling rigs everywhere, as well as the OPEC Plus production cut deal, and also obviously demand recovery that has occurred over the months since everything began. So U.S. crude oil inventories are now down to 496 million barrels in storage, and oil prices are back up over $40 a barrel, as the previous week they had dropped back under 40, down to around 37 or 38, but now this week, as the news came out that they resumed decreasing, the prices climbed back up over 40 and are presently right around 41. Now, U.S. oil production recovered from 10 million barrels a day up to 10.9 million barrels a day, recovering the remaining two-thirds or three-quarters of the Gulf of Mexico oil production shutdowns that were caused by the previous hurricanes. However, now after yet another hurricane and a tropical storm soon to become a hurricane that is currently drifting around in the Gulf of Mexico oil production is being shut down in fair portions, potentially large portions again. So once we get the upcoming data, we are probably going to see that number drop back down again, most likely into the lower 10s. Now U.S. oil consumption dropped back down a bit, currently at just above 17 million barrels a day, with the individual composing numbers within that being U.S. gasoline consumption recovering a little bit of the demand that was lost from the previous hurricane, coming back up to 8.48 million barrels a day. Normally, in present day, under non-2020 circumstances, U.S. gasoline demand is usually between 9 and 10, and a couple weeks back, it did actually get back up over 9 once for 1 week. U.S. diesel fuel consumption for the week took a sudden drop. Even throughout the whole 2020 situation, U.S. diesel fuel consumption never really left its normal range for any prolonged period of time, which is usually a bit over or below 4 million barrels a day. It looks like this week, however, it took a sudden drop down to 2.8 million barrels a day, and U.S. jet fuel demand, which is usually, under normal circumstances, between 1.6 and 2 million barrels a day, came in for the week at 947,000 barrels a day. And U.S. propane consumption picked up to 1.48 million barrels per day equivalent, as since the colder months are approaching, a lot of propane heating tanks are probably filling up at the moment. Normally, during the warmer months for the lower 48 states, propane consumption tends to stay below 1 million and is usually between like 600 and 900,000 barrels a day, most of which is being used to make propylene, which is being used to make polypropylene, aka the second most common type of plastic. Now, outside of the US, but including the US, global jet fuel consumption normally in present day would be between 6 and 8 million barrels a day, but obviously it's not because of the 2020 circumstances. And at the worst part of the whole situation, during all the travel restrictions and shutdowns in mid-April, global jet fuel demand had dropped all the way down to 1.7, and over the months since then, it was recovering until about a month and a half ago. It basically leveled off, sticking between 5 and 5.1. Presently this week coming in at 5.1 million barrels a day, and most of what's remaining missing from that being the jet fuel that would be getting consumed for all the travel between North America and Europe that would otherwise be going on, as well as the travel between Latin America and the entire outside world. Now we got the monthly update for Australia's demand numbers, and theirs is staggered but not by too far back, so this is their July data, and normally Australia's gasoline consumption is anywhere between 300 and 350,000 barrels a day. At the worst part of this, back in April, it dropped all the way down to a bit under 140,000, and since then it's been recovering up to about 200, then up to about 250, and now it looks like as of July it was up to a bit higher at 257,000 barrels a day. And Australia's diesel fuel consumption is normally around 500,000 barrels a day, and it never really took a hit. That's the story for basically everybody. Basically, nobody's diesel fuel consumption really changed because, diesel is primarily heavy vehicles and freight trucks and stuff, whereas what came to a screeching halt was personal travel and running about. So Australia's diesel fuel consumption never really took too big of a hit. I believe at the worst it was down towards 400,000 barrels a day, but then it quickly went back up to around 500,000. And as of July, it looks like it was a bit under it at 487,000 barrels a day. Now, Australia's jet fuel demand, which is normally the same as Canada's, they both normally have about 100,000 barrels a day of jet fuel consumption. Australia's jet fuel demand at the worst part of all this dropped all the way down into the teens. Then it recovered back up into the 30s. Previously, it was at about 38, and now it looks like it's at about just under 43,000 barrels a day. Now, along with U.S. crude oil inventories, we have another negative milestone crosser over in natural gas. U.S. natural gas production has, for the first time in a few years, since it first crossed over it, U.S. natural gas production has dropped back under 100 billion cubic feet per day, dropping down now to 99.1, and it might oscillate, bounce back above it a few times before continuing on the downward trend. But U.S. natural gas production hit its shale-driven second and likely final peak back in late December or early January at around 109, and then it began declining from there, so it was already on its way downward for several months before the whole collapse in the drilling rig count. Granted, that did give it a little bit of extra downward speed, and I'd suspect if 2020 hadn't happened, it would probably still be a little bit higher, like maybe between 2 and 4 billion cubic feet per day higher than it's gotten down to now, but it was already on its way downward. And U.S. natural gas consumption for the week averaged 81.1 billion cubic feet per day, with the individual numbers composing that being heating demand still down in single digits as the cold months haven't hit the lower 48 states yet. So heating demand coming in at 8.3 billion cubic feet per day, consumption by natural gas-fired power plants continuing to drop, as the heat for the lower 48 states has mostly stopped. Outside heat, weather heat, climate heat, has mostly stopped. It hasn't crossed into cold temperatures yet, but the heat's mostly stopped, so AC demand, air conditioning has been dropping, thus dropping electricity demand, thus dropping consumption of natural gas by natural gas-fired power plants. So demand from natural gas-fired power plants dropped a little bit further down, now down to 32.8 billion cubic feet per day. U.S. natural gas exports on LNG tankers have bounced back up this week to a level they have not seen in many months, with 7 billion cubic feet per day heading off on LNG tankers. Consumption by the pipelines for its own pumping system fuel to move all the natural gas around coming in at 6.5, and industrial consumption, the most stable one that doesn't really change by huge amounts, only increasing a tiny bit from last week, coming up to 20.8 billion cubic feet per day, as well as a huge chunk of that industrial consumption being natural gas that's being used in the nitrogen fixation process to extract nitrogen from the atmosphere. U.S. natural gas storage inventories are up to 3.61 trillion cubic feet in storage. In comparison to normally at this time of year, they would still be down at 3.19. And last year, which had been a very high demand winter year, they were still down at 3.08. And natural gas prices also took a sudden drop by about 30 or 40 cents, dropping from the 230s down under $2 per thousand cubic feet for a little bit before, just as the week ended, popping right back over it, just over it, so right above $2. All right, that's about it for the second recording of this one. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already, support if you want through PayPal or Patreon. They're both down there. And no matter what happens to me, may God bless all of you, and I will see you all around next time.